Welcome to Intersections, where faith, ideas, and life meet. Today we'll be talking about keeping the Sabbath. The title of our conversation is Celebrating the Sabbath. As many of you know, I was not raised as a Sabbath keeper, and I remember coming into awareness of the idea of a Sabbath. And for me, it had a delicious sound to it, because in my family, we worked a lot. We had a huge garden, and one of the roles of my sister and I were to simply go out into the garden and pick up the rocks and throw them over the side of the bank. The idea that there would be a Sabbath where one did not have to do that brought me much joy. So I didn't grow up with the same feeling of do's and don'ts on Sabbath. I grew up with the idea that Sabbath was a relief from all the do's and just a really enjoyable time, and that has continued to this day. But it's not that way for many. We're working with the text, or one of the texts that we're working with is out of the Ten Commandments, and I'll just read the first part of it. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. The question is, how do we not only keep the Sabbath, but celebrate the Sabbath?
And that's a really challenging thing for somebody who knows nothing but Adventism in terms of religious experience, such as myself. I've come to really enjoy the Sabbath for the relief that it provides me and the possibility of celebration that it affords me. But I have to also say that still today I struggle with the notion of keeping the Sabbath holy, that idea of being restricted from certain things that I enjoy, and how I balance the two, rejoicing yet not just engaging in kind of just personal, leisurely things too much. I wrestle with that, and I have this love-hate relationship with Sabbath personally, I think.
I wrestle with the same thing too, Julius. I think, you know, I have to, for me to consciously keep the Sabbath, I have to maintain that sort of that sense of conscious awareness of, okay, how am I treating this day any differently from the other 6 days of the week? For me, that celebration, you know, it plays forth in how I choose to actively live my life differently on the Sabbath. It's not just going to church, it's the other activities that I engage in or I don't engage in. And how to maintain that conscious awareness while really feeling like it's a day of celebration is hard for me, because for me to celebrate means I don't have a schedule. I don't have to think about it. I can just kind of relax and do whatever I want to do.
Now you've mentioned,
but I don't feel that way a lot of times.
You mentioned the phrase conscious awareness 2 or 3 times, Jeremy. Is there some sort of, what is the conscious awareness that's going on Sabbath that isn't, or is it a different awareness, or can you just say what you mean by that phrase?
Sure, I think it's you know, a state of mind where you're more or less focused in on God, at least for me. Trying to really take myself away from everything that I do on a normal basis, whether it's work or school or my social activities, and completely try to absorb myself in that relationship, whether, you know, engaging directly in my own personal devotions or time spent with family, friends, fellowship, those kinds of things.
I'm wondering, when we talk about keep the Sabbath, isn't it keep the Sabbath holy? So do you ever get mixed up between keep the Sabbath and the holy part?
What do you mean by that?
Well, you mentioned, Julius, about the do's and don'ts earlier on. And Carla, you mentioned coming from a different religious denomination. When you embraced the Sabbath, it was a real refreshing rest there. But I was raised, you know, from a Sabbath-keeping family too. And I remember the do's and don'ts. And it didn't make sense to me. A lot of the do's and don'ts. Why don't you go swimming on Sabbath when it's really hot? And I think a lot of people have kind of wrestled with that one, decided it's okay to go swimming because it's a delight, you know, it's restful, and, you know, you can kind of really get a blessing doing that. But at the same time, I think if we take God out of the keeping of the Sabbath, it can become incredibly laborious. I remember a friend saying to me one day, you can never keep the Sabbath. He used to say to me, you can't do that. Only God can keep the Sabbath. He's the creator, he's perfect. So if we take the holy part out of it, I think he's right.
One of the things that young Adventists growing up within the Adventist community rebel against, I think, is what you call the do's and don'ts. And it's been many, many years, I think, where the Sabbath is seen as a part of the law. And when you say the law, you're not talking about a pilgrimage, a community that's going somewhere, and here's how we're doing it together. The law is something you go to court over, and you're punished, perhaps. And that whole set of metaphors, it seems to me, is terribly unfortunate. And that the word celebrating can take the whole category of the Sabbath and make it a part of worship, so that it's parallel, not with law and each of the 10 Commandments telling us how to behave, particularly the second half of the 10 Commandments, but law goes along with baptism and with the Lord's Supper. It's those communal events where we do feel and invite the presence of God. And it's different than other things. You don't do a baptism over and over again. You don't do every week the Lord's Supper, if you're in the Protestant tradition. And the Sabbath is not the same as the other days. And so it is a time to really have a special, unique sort of time with God. And if it doesn't have that, then what's the point?
You just said something. You know, Roy, you just said something that made me connect with something that Jeremy said. You just said the Sabbath should not be the same as every other day. And then, Jeremy, you talked about conscious awareness. And when I went to secular university, I was trying to think about how not to make it like every other day and how to have a conscious awareness and putting those two together. And I remember, because my whole degree was about religion. So if I was to do what we normally think is okay on Sabbath, it would be to study religion. But in order to make it not like every other day, and in order to have a conscious awareness that it was a holy sort of a time, I actually decided not to do any of my studies, even that were related to religious things, on Sabbath. But my point was going to be is that my professors better understood it when I said, my guideline is that things that don't make me anxious, things that don't steal away my attitude toward God, and I think my studies would, that they understood, that I might not even go to religious functions on Sabbath that were related to school in ways that would make me anxious and pull me away from that. But it wasn't until then that I even thought of a guideline. It was all about do's and don'ts. So your phrase really caught me.
The tension that I talked about love-hate relationship with the Sabbath, and the tension that I feel is one, the desire to do things that are overtly, perhaps even exclusively religious, sacred, God-oriented, worshipful. At the same time, I also believe that the Sabbath ought to be a day when we celebrate life as God has given us. Yeah. Even if it's not overtly sacred, even if it's not overtly worshipful, such as, God has given us muscles, so God has given us ability to swim, or not me actually, but maybe some of you. And so can we celebrate life as God has given us by swimming in the ocean, even if it means to exert ourselves and not really think consciously about God, but that would be celebration, wouldn't it?
Might some of us, Julius, say that for me, it takes that consciousness away, and I don't want to be out in a swimsuit throwing a volleyball on Sabbath, but I might do scuba, or might someone say I can't do either? I mean, do you think people will have differences?
Clearly there will be differences. I think the debate, if there is one, and I think there is one, is over conscious awareness of what?
True, because if it's your own personal conscious awareness, I mean, it's pretty much left open to your own interpretation then. And a question that always pops into my mind is, what about the question of work and of rest on Sabbath in that context of celebration? Because I know for myself, there are certain activities that people might classify as work. For example, for me, it would be working on a car. I love working on cars. For me, it's such a restful, peaceful experience. But maybe I have my garage door open and someone drives by and sees me working on my car on Sabbath and might think, why is he working on the Sabbath?
Or planning a sermon would be work for me, but I might think it's okay to do on Sabbath and not work on the car. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I do think that there ideally is a consciousness of the transcendent. I mean, working on a car is one thing, but I think that the activities,
One thing is in.
Do you want to
What
defend
kind
that?
of one thing?
you know,
Are you saying that's not transcendent?
it sure doesn't sound like it to me.
But Roy, if you just compare the two activities, I speak all the time and I'm preparing for my sermon on the Sabbath. I don't want to get him in trouble here, but
No.
he's working on his car. Would mine seem more holy than that or more transcendent?
I think that you've got a better shot.
Well, and I think that's generally speaking the mentality that we
Yeah,
have is
it
that there
is.
are
That's
certain
right.
activities that are more, I don't know what you want to say, predisposed to being of more of that eternal or higher nature.
Yeah, let me make an argument that for 20th century Americans or Europeans or anybody,
You mean 21st?
21st.
21st, right,
Come to the century.
there you go. I think that we have a hard time with the spiritual disciplines, with things where we say, now we're going to put ourselves in a situation where we can receive the transcendent. And nobody wants to be a monk except a very, very few people in different religious traditions. The Sabbath is that kind of spiritual experience available to everybody. And it seems to me, while I don't want to get into don't do this, don't do that, one should focus, it seems to me. And there are ways to focus, like going to church. I have a lot of friends who say, oh, I go to the mountaintop. Well, God bless you, you know. But there's a certain kind of activity, it seems to me, that you have when you come together and you are doing things that traditionally put us in the position to be in touch with the transcendent.
Is it called worship?
Worship, I think, is got to
Communal?
be a part of it, and communal, yes.
Then what about you worship in the morning,
I do, yeah.
have even potluck or that eating fellowship with your fellow parishioners, fellow believers,
And then you work on your car.
and then you got it's now daylight saving time, so you got 7 hours, 8 hours of Sabbath time. And I think oftentimes for an average Seventh-day Adventist, that's where the do's and don'ts dilemma enters. What do we do, and what can we do, and should we
Well,
not?
I'll tell you what I've done.
How do you keep the concept of the transcendence? I love that phrase you're using. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead. No. Well,
We're all about cutting each other off.
when I was growing up in New York City, what I would do often is to go to art galleries. And it was a little attenuated. I mean, I would have felt bad if all I did on Sabbath was go to art galleries. But I'm responding specifically to you, what do you do in the afternoons, you know? And I think that is one way to, if you think about it, see the suffering, perhaps, as people, but also how people overcome
Okay, I'm
suffering.
going to be the devil's advocate here. In order to go to the art gallery, you'd have to pay to get in.
No, not in New York City.
Oh, okay. But someone's got to keep all that up on the Sabbath.
Would you pay to put you on the spot?
Would I pay? Well, that would be a good question.
I guess all I'm saying is, it seems like when it comes to our own institutions, we understand that people have to take care of them on Sabbath. They might be there for custodial issues, they might be there for all kinds of issues. But if they were to have that same job somewhere else, it might pose a problem. I guess what I'm asking is, are there guidelines for keeping Sabbath that would just apply? And rather than say you can or can't work on your car, or you can or can't prepare for a sermon on Sabbath.
Or eat out.
Or eat out. What are the guidelines?
Let me give you an example, an incident. There was an administrator who is no longer an administrator because he retired, of an Adventist hospital, very successful, big. He came and convened a group of Adventist theologians. Many of us had written on the Sabbath. And about, it was an all-day meeting. About 10:30, we realized that what he was wanting is for this group to anoint the possibility of his health center expanding clinics in malls on Sabbath.
Oh,
And because it was healing, then we would be for it. And I found myself outraged. What he wanted to do was to make more money, basically. And he wanted the priests in the church, the Adventist church, to anoint it. And we said no. Now, we're laying down guidelines. But if an Adventist community tries to do extra things on Sabbath to earn money, that's a violation, it seems to me, of what Adventism is about in a medical institutional setting. Now, what I wish they would do is give free back rubs in the hospital.
Whoa, that was a leap. But what would be the guideline? What would be the guideline of why that wouldn't have been comfortable for you?
Because I think you're giving an extra service, not making money as an institution, by doing something for people so that the day is special for even the stranger
like
within
that.
your gates.
Well, I know that when I worked as a nurse, the day I decided to give all the money I made on Sabbath to the church, to God, or to some charity, it certainly changed the amount of Sabbaths I wanted to work. So I think even the idea that we're encouraged to do healing on the Sabbath does not mean even still that it should be for our personal gain.
And most Adventist institutions, I think, do not have elective surgery. Emergency, yes, but not elective. It's the same principle.
That changed a bit with, some of the hospital link.
I do agree with Roy in his emphasis on the transcendent. I think, although I think it'll be difficult to have a specific guideline on various activities. I think,
Right.
Yeah, it would be
But how is
impossible.
healing the transcendent? How does healing relate to focusing on the transcendent?
He's coming to that.
Okay.
I was actually going a different direction.
Oh, okay.
Now I lost my train of thought. But
Sorry.
no, the transcendent, I think for many people, I think there's a certain universality to putting our minds on the things that cannot be seen, the things of the divine that lifts us up. And even as I support doing things that are very mundane, or working, planting seeds, or working on the flower, if that's what helps one to really celebrate the Sabbath, I think it is easy to forget the meaning of the day by working on the mundane, quote-unquote, profane things of life. And so there's a certain direction that one ought to engage in and also be reminded of that take us to the transcendent. But I think it is important to also recognize that life is filled with footprints and imprints of God, and being able to see that,
Right.
I think is a wonderful thing.
There's a huge difference, it seems to me, with a family that goes to a babbling brook, and they go in and they walk in it and so on, and a crowd of young people who go to the beach and all the radios are blasting away, and people have a setting of carnival.
Mm-hmm.
That, it seems to me, is a very different atmosphere. You're both doing something with the water and something beside the water, but it's hugely different, and that's what one attends to.
Except for
What-
the, go
What
ahead.
makes the atmosphere different?
Well, I think that if people are, as a family, sort of communing with nature, as one might say, that's a whole different thing than a bunch of people who don't care anything about the transcendent and are just, leading
But
lives.
does it have to be sort of nature to be transcendent?
No, I would say going to the museums could be
Sure.
transcendent.
Because one of the challenges that I see is so many of the, at least in my own Sabbath tradition, so many of my practices were very mono or self-oriented. It was all centering around the things that I do or don't do, and less focused on other people. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see in my own faith now. Is so many times I feel like I want to lend myself to participating in activities that would possibly sort of take me out of that conscious awareness of Sabbath, because I'm focusing in on other people's needs as opposed to my own. And it's the reason why on Sabbath I may really feel that I need to take a nap or to rest, and yet I will consciously make the decision to go and to feed the homeless or do something of that nature.
That's really, for me, when it comes down to it, the biggest challenge on a week-to-week basis, the temptation to just withdraw and do things that are celebration, restful, but of that personal time, that private time with me and my family, maybe the closest friends, and that's it, and not turning it around into something that is of more communal, broader service nature, withdrawing from that because I think that I'm serving the community the rest of the week. that's a day for myself, and sometimes that's too much of a temptation.
See, part of the challenge I think that many of us deal with, especially in busy Southern California, is that every moment is scheduled.
That's right.
There's things happening all the time, and it's very hard to take time for the transcendent, to use Roy's comment about God. And so I loved it when you opened the program, Carla, talking about the Sabbath being a time, where you could kind of just be. You didn't use those words, but basically just be. And I think some of us turn it into, into the behavior rather than the relational part of it. Obviously, behavior is important, but it comes out of the relationship. And I just love it, Roy, when you talked about putting God in the middle of it.
Well, I think you ought to thank the Lord that if He allows you to have time to commune with your family and with God. If we turn the Sabbath into a super active way to be ethical, it's good in a general sense, but it could be the breaking of the Sabbath too.
Absolutely. Well, and Jeremy mentioned the word rest. I'm just looking here at Hebrews and the tying of Sabbath with the idea of a different kind of rest, or the idea of justification by faith. That it's a symbol of having been saved from our own works. It's not just about stopping the work. It's about being relieved of having to gain something through that work. And I think that's a very different picture, is that I get to rest. I don't have to rest. I get to rest because God is taking care of it. And then Sabbath is a relief, not a job.
Heschel, who was a rabbi,
yeah.
of course, talked about the fact that 6 days you work and you're involved with God's creation, but the seventh day is not a negation, it's a surplus. It is all of creation.
That's right.
Plus
Plus.
God's presence. And I think that is the kind of mysticism that really resonates for me. Not the subtraction, but the addition.
And the first day, according to the Genesis story, that human beings knew, the first full day was the Sabbath. So life began with the Sabbath. And in many ways, in the book
Right.
of Hebrews, that fullness of life that we look forward to is
Yes.
called
Right.
the Sabbath life.
Well,
Yeah.
this is a historical religion. Judeo-Christian tradition is historical. That means it goes somewhere. And in the story of creation, these days ascend in more and more complex life, ending with God as represented in the Sabbath, being with God in the Sabbath. And I think that's where they get the idea that it's a surplus.
Well, and to remember, we're not the only tradition as far as Adventism that celebrates a day. It used to be, when I was growing up, people kept Sunday in that way, where they were not cleaning the house and washing the clothes. So we're not the only tradition that has an idea
Let me interject
Time.
just real quick. What of our viewers at home who are sitting here and saying, I don't want to hear about all those esoteric concepts. I just want to know on a practical level, what does celebrating the Sabbath mean for me? I'm a mom or a dad. I have 2 or 3 kids that I'm trying to raise in the tradition of the Sabbath. How do I go about doing that?
And you would say?
Ferrari.
The best of the best. Well, in reflecting on my own experience, I know going back to that concept of the do's and the don'ts, as a child, I can strongly remember that was my perception of the Sabbath. It was a day when I did certain activities and I didn't do other activities, and that's all that it was.
We entitled our program as Celebrating, and I think that's really, for me, that's been a helpful focus. Rather than worrying about what we are not going to do, how are we going to make this a beautiful day? And the decisions that we've made as a family, haven't always been the same decisions that were kind of given to me or made for me growing up. It's very typical that we go to a restaurant on Sabbath, although it doesn't happen all the time. It happens pretty regularly because nobody wants to cook on the Sabbath. Now, one could say you should have prepared beforehand. That's sort of the way I grew up. But no, it's a day when we don't stress about cooking and we celebrate. We may do all kinds of things per se that may be seen as secular, but together as family, as friends, as community, it's an act of celebration. And so it's always difficult to be answering your question, how can we keep this day? But I think if you focus our attention on celebrating, there's just abundant resources and possibilities.
I think if you were to canvas kids and not always do exactly what they want, but what's special? What's the adventure that they would like to do that they haven't been able to do through the week? What are the friends that they would like to have? Not necessarily that you do exactly what they want to do when the friends come over, but you get together perhaps. Or they travel somewhere that they've heard about and it's within distance. Something that sounds like festivity.
Fun, yeah,
Right.
interesting.
And that stays within celebration. Keeping the Sabbath seems to me a very unfortunate term. Hugging it so that it doesn't belong to everybody else, I don't know.
We're almost out of time. I think it's an incredible discussion because a lot of people do wrestle with what to do on the Sabbath. But what I've got from our conversation today is that basically bring God into it. And sometimes we need to be reminded about doing that. Bring God into it. So if we go swimming, are we relating to God? Is God in the picture somewhere? No matter what. It's a day set aside. And I remember some people saying, well, you can keep every day. But we are so busy that we don't. And so the Sabbath is a real practical time where I think we can remember that bringing God into the picture purposefully can bring many, many blessings. We're almost out of time, but I think as we talk about this is a topic that can go on and on and on because each of us are different and we need to do that and celebrate our individuality. Thank you for watching Intersections where faith, life, and faith, meaning, and life meet.